Hello and welcome to The Ruffian, with me, Ian Leslie. Britain is in a depression. Not in an economic sense, we're still growing, albeit fairly slowly, but in a cultural and political sense. We're running low on self-esteem, on national pride, and most dangerously of all, on hope. On the sense that whatever our problems as a country might be, they can be fixed. Voters have become deeply cynical about the political class. They no longer believe anyone's promises, and support for both main parties has collapsed. Those within the political class seem more intent on fighting each other and posturing than in actually solving problems. A government which came into power just over a year ago with a big majority is widely regarded as ineffectual, in office but not in control. Many voters are turning to reform, not necessarily because they believe that Nigel Farage will fix anything, but because he captures the almost nihilistic mood of dissatisfaction and despair. Meanwhile, our society faces urgent problems that simply can't be addressed without a government that knows what it wants to do and has enough popular support to get it done. So, how can Britain get out of this moment? How can it get happy again? Broadly speaking, there are two paths out of here, which in reality have to be travelled at the same time. The first one is economic growth. Getting Britain richer on a per capita basis may not be a wonder pill, but it's the closest thing we have to one. When more Brits are getting pay increases, owning their own homes, starting businesses, living in towns that seem vibrant and thriving, the country will feel more confident and optimistic. But higher growth won't come unless we make progress down a second path. This path is a cultural and psychological one. We need people to believe that they can improve things, that they can improve their lives, their communities, their country. We need people with the will to make great things happen at every level: workers, bosses, entrepreneurs, civil servants and politicians. One way of putting this is that we need a more high agency culture. And that's what I'm going to discuss with returning guest and friend of the show, James Kanagasooriam, Chief Research Officer at Focal Data. James is a pollster and one of the most brilliant political and cultural analysts around. And he's just completed a major research project on agency and happiness amongst British voters. I'm delighted to have him on the pod to discuss his findings. So James, this word agency has been bandied about a lot recently. For listeners with only a vague idea of what we mean by it, can you define it for us?
Sure, and thanks, Ian. Pleasure to be on. Agency is a funny word. I would borrow the terminology from my favourite thinker on agency, Kate Hall. We can come back to her. Kate Hall, mm-hmm. Yeah, extraordinary character. But she describes it as the ability to see and act on the degrees of freedom that anyone has. And she also has a secondary definition, which I prefer, which is the manifest determination to make things happen. Right. So you're thinking of a slogan, go back to your old job.
Yes, advertising.
Advertising. It's kind of a Nike mentality. Just do it.
Just do it.
In Kate's new book, is you can just do things.
And that's become a kind of catchphrase actually among Silicon Valley types. You can just do things.
Well, the high agency movement has been incubated from Silicon Valley, precisely because it's a strong kind of cultural kind of element of entrepreneurialism and people that do startups. But interestingly, and this is where it gets really meta, in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of development around technology that's described as agentic. And that technology is effectively the ability for different pieces of information, code, software, co-pilots to basically act independently and to just do things together.
Now, okay, I don't want to get sucked into the technology.
We've already got pretty far in.
That's for another time. But let's just stay with humans, really, for this conversation. When we talk about a high agency person or a high agency culture, so essentially we're talking about a person or a culture where people feel that they can make a difference and change the world. They don't have to accept the status quo. They're not passive. They're active. They have ideas about what they want to do, and they have a feeling that I can go out and do that.
That's exactly right. So if I was to describe it, first of all with a poem, and then second of all with a polling question, just to mix it up a bit.
Brilliant.
I first started thinking about agency in response to a trip to Robben Island, which is where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for all those years. Yeah. And I found out, and then it was made into a rather naff film, so this anecdote doesn't really work. It was one of the poems that inspired Nelson Mandela was a poem by, I think, William Ernst Henley called Invictus. And there's a line where he describes being a captain of his own fate, master of his own fate, and captain of his own soul. It's just the idea that you do have control, and the key word there is control. And I see it when we measure it and when we look into agency, a proxy question that we often use is how much freedom of choice and control do you feel you have over the way that your life turns out?
Right.
And that for me is how you practically would measure agency.
Okay. So we're going to get into your findings from the research, but I want to talk a little bit more about how you've been thinking about it as well, because that's informed the design of your survey. We've talked about what agency is. You also talk about the rise of agency suppressing beliefs, beliefs and ideas that are counter to agency in the culture. Can you just give us an idea of what you mean by that? Which ideas or cultural trends are the enemy of agency?
So agency suppressing beliefs, not my term,
okay.
Is very much the idea, cultural ideas that are fed into the population or present in the population that basically tell people that they're not in control, that it's not up to them, and that they don't have agency, they don't have control over their own fates, they're effectively helpless. And the reason I guess this came about was from a kind of Substack that I wrote about observing more and more groups seem to feel that they're left behind. And this seems to have become completely dislocated from what I would say is the more objective measure of being left behind, which is being poor, not having any money, and being from a deprived area. And it just seemed to me that more and more different sectors were overlapping where on some basis, almost anyone could say, I'm left behind, I'm not in control, I am effectively not a victor but a victim. And that hypothesis then I think was very much built on the numbers of people, political arguments that are made, basically which are posited, which tell people that they're not in control and that it's someone else that is to blame, whether it's left or right. And that's where it kind of came in. And I call that what do I call it, the Nietzschean trap. Well, it's kind of the opposite of I guess the philosopher Nietzsche's idea that people can have some kind of will and enact that, but it's also downstream of his philosophy of something called ressentiment, which is he posited in a lot of his books. A big feature is that a lot of society is driven by resentment, multi-dimensional resentment. And my hypothesis was that the Nietzschean trap in Britain is extraordinarily big.
So the Nietzschean trap is
this idea that no matter where you're from or who you are, what assets you have or where you are or what you're doing, you have been hard done by.
Yeah.
Because some people have been hard done by, definitionally. But a world in which everyone feels that they're hard done by is a very toxic one. And it explains I thought it would explain quite a lot. So, I talk about the exhibits of what a Nietzschean trap is. And they're not left or right. They're just kind of observational. So my first one was a slight tick I felt after the EU referendum, where we were talking about the left behind and the not left behind. Because the 2016 vote, we're nearly coming up to 10 years of it, was fought on educational lines. So people who much less likely to have a degree meant you were more likely to vote leave. If you did have a degree, more likely to vote remain. But underneath the surface, there was all sorts of things going on where I was like, this is not as simple as the establishment. This is the left behind. Because last time I checked, Merseyside and Haringey, North Haringey, are not the establishment, where huge amounts of deprivation. And last time I checked, huge tracts of
they
Surrey,
were
and they were
Remain.
pro-Remain,
Yeah.
and then huge tracts of, I don't know, Wiltshire, Somerset, Devon. The idea that
Oh yeah.
home-owning, rich, literal millionaire Britain, and I haven't done the maths yet of whether there were more millionaires in Leave Land than Remain. My instinct would be yes,
Right.
based on age. And suddenly that just became the lexicon. So I thought, oh, that's really interesting. But it's also across a number of different things, you know, Nietzschean trap, this feeling of resentment. I noticed that a lot of people who belong to quite radical progressive groups like Extinction Rebellion appear to not be slightly rich, but from extremely privileged millionaire backgrounds, where
Yeah.
they've kind of reimagined their role as one of where they're effectively being hard done by, which you could argue from a climate change perspective, but it's really interesting that it's really only the very rich. If you take any pictures of Extinction Rebellion or any of those other groups, it's really extraordinary if you look at the demographics. A couple of other features, it's maybe a bit unfair, but someone sent me a podcast of Meghan Markle talking about the challenges of being a co-founder of a business, and I thought that's so meta that a literal princess is talking in a podcast about overcoming hurdles.
Yeah.
And it just seemed to me quite dystopian. And this whole, you know, it's also more prosaic stuff, like people can underestimate where they sit on the income spectrum. It's also aspects of certain access schemes, for example, that are open to some people but not to others. It seemed to me that everywhere, everyone is trying to corner off a bit of their own mental landscape where they can basically self-define as being hard done by.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Meghan Markle example is interesting because, you know, I know people don't like her, some people like her, but it's not really so much. The interesting thing is not so much about her personality. It's that if she is looking for a kind of easily comprehensible and understandable script to talk about dissatisfaction in her life, she will reach for, you know, nobody understands how hard it is for me. There's all these kind of forces ranged against me. And because that is just the script that is available to everyone, really, at every kind of level. There's always some version of that.
You've been hard done by, you need help. And for me, it was not a kind of right or left coded thing. I'm seeing this across the kind of cultural spectrum rather than the political one.
Yeah.
And we hypothesized that it was very closely related to happiness and very closely related to a sense that you were in control and a sense that things could get better and optimism. And, you know, I've thought very hard about agency being important, but it's all very well having a hypothesis, right? The whole point was to then test it and to actually see, is this an actual thing?
Yeah. Okay. So let's get into the research. What exactly how did you define your goals? What did you set out to discover? And broadly speaking, how did you go about it?
Two separate things. The first was to try and understand, top line level, how many people don't feel they have agency. And depending on your definition, it's between 20 to 35% of people of the UK,
Wow.
which struck me as very high. 1 in 3 adults basically saying, I'm not in control. I don't have responsibility for my actions.
Yeah.
I don't know how to make my life better. That seems quite high, given the UK's relative wealth versus the rest of the world. Right? If you took that same kind of income level distribution and then extrapolated that across the world, that would be a fairly catastrophic outcome.
Yeah.
The second was then to understand what's driving that. So what are the different dimensions under which people can feel that they are kind of left behind, from the super objective to the more subjective? So we looked at things like, would people expect to receive an inheritance above a certain amount? And actually huge numbers of people don't expect to receive kind of a material inheritance above a certain amount. Number of people who would consider themselves lower income, the number of people who believe that their education level has been a barrier to getting a job, the number of people who don't feel represented in the media or in film, or just see themselves in kind of culture, the number of people who are unhappy, the number of people who would self-define as disabled, the number of people who are in an AI-exposed job, the number of people who have, and this is getting into the crunchier stuff, people who have markers from their background that put them at a disadvantage. So people who may have grown up with one parent rather than two, number of people who might be from a protected characteristic, people who don't feel in control. We looked at a huge number of factors. And what we found is that the overlap between them was fairly mild. And it slightly started to explain that actually the more compounding factors you had, the lower agency you felt, and the lower agency that an area would be, for example, as well. And for me, that was really interesting, because what the list that I've just put out is a really kind of complex mixture of like really hard, verifiable things that clearly put people at a disadvantage to basically stuff that you feel and is basically non-falsifiable. And because of that, there's this sense, just mathematically, that almost anyone in some way, if they were talking about their lives, could say, I've overcome X. I think we had fewer than 2.5% of people who had no markers of what you could consider someone to have a disadvantage.
Right.
10% of people roughly had one. Roughly 20% of people had two. Right? And then we've got a massive mix of people with a really long tail of people who have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 markers. Now that's interesting. That's observational. That's like how much agency exists in the UK and how much agency doesn't exist in the UK. It's quite high.
Yeah.
And I'm conducting with our teams a couple of international studies, and it does seem that the UK is in a really bad position internationally. And the Public Affairs Edelman have also looked into this. Turns out we're one of the worst in the world. We're 2 points off being the worst of all measurable countries.
In terms of?
Felt disadvantage.
Yeah.
Which, given the size of the state, the economy, GDP per capita, doesn't matter where you look, the GDP per capita in some part of the country is still bigger than the majority of the world. So that, for me, is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But the really important thing is how is this linked to happiness? How is this linked to voting? How is this linked to all of the different, the vector of beliefs, if you want to put it like that? And that's where it gets really interesting, because it seemed to us from the analysis that we did, we basically built a model. And I don't do much of the actual work these days, but I actually did it this time because I was really, really interested into it. And basically we found that being low agency is very highly correlated to one of the big 5 traits called neuroticism. John Byrne Murdoch of the FT has done a lot of this. Mm-hmm. The growth of neurotic belief sets, which is the opposite of being conscientious, basically, has exploded.
Yeah. And neuroticism just generally stands for worries a lot, high anxiety.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's literally a list of items that you would measure in a survey that is being agreed on. It's one of the big 5 psychological types. So we're not saying and making any judgment. It's a literal term.
Yeah.
It's very strongly associated with neuroticism, but it's also very sharply correlated with other features like capriciousness, narcissism, anxiety, as you pointed out. But then gets really, really interesting and a bit more crunchy, that basically once you combine it with more objective measures of deprivation, almost the entire cultural space of Britain can find a pathway to unhappiness, is the way I would describe it.
Right.
Like public opinion polls have Britain at 70 to 80% of people unhappy. The baseline level view of that is because we've been badly governed.
Just unhappy in their lives?
For the country, in their lives.
Wow. Okay.
Which is high and is a massive problem, and is one of the reasons we keep on going through these political cycles and revolutions that are happening quicker and quicker.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, a lot of that is to do with actual hard data on the lack of growth in the country, as you pointed out top, right? There's very, very good evidence. We created a model to predict happiness, and a huge amount of it is how much money do you have? What's your income? What's your inheritance? Do you have a disadvantage at home in terms of having a proximity to drugs and alcohol in your childhood?
Yeah. Wait, so when you say data, you don't mean they're not reading that the economy is growing at 2 points. You're talking about the lived experience, as we say these days, of noticing their lives.
But then beliefs also matter.
Right, yeah.
A lot.
Sure.
Like mindset. So there's money and mindset. If you were to completely simplify the whole thing, basically money plus mindset equals happiness, which sounds really simple, but it's in our findings, it's a regression model rather than it being like some weird catchphrase that's unevidenced.
Yeah.
But then we did find basically that being high agency, if we were to make this more positive, is basically associated with being pluralist. Mm-hmm. So being excited by contact with people with different views. it's associated with being trusting towards other people and the government and society and to institutions.
Which is hugely important.
Hugely important.
to a
And is
successful
associated
society.
with optimism.
Yes.
So
Right.
I think for me, that's by far the biggest finding, which is that all the good stuff is clustered together. Being pluralist, being optimistic, being agentic, being trusting,
Yeah.
um,
Being non-zero
and
sum.
non-zero sum and conscientious. I had no idea, and it wasn't my hypothesis at all until we had done the work. And I should mention, the team I had, Patrick Flynn is a data journalist who helped me out as well.
Yeah.
A lot with this.
Sorry to interrupt, but what would have been your hypothesis? Like, what was the surprise there for you? Can you just define that
I
a bit
just
more
didn't
clearly?
like. They're very different things, right?
Yeah.
Being optimistic, being pluralist,
Mm.
kind of tolerant of different viewpoints, of being conscientious, of being high trust. These are categorically very different things, right? I can think of plenty of people who are one and not the other.
Yeah.
But in general, in the data, they tended to cluster together. In polling terms, they co-vary.
Yeah.
And for me, when we built the kind of happiness model, the first thing that was really clear is that the idea that money isn't important is for the birds. Do you remember, like 10 years ago, we had a movement, kind of a post-growth movement,
It's still going.
where people were like, oh, maybe it isn't about money. Plot GDP per capita
It's a pretty good guide.
versus life expectancy versus education rate versus really anything, right?
And happiness data.
And happiness data, very tightly clustered. It should never, and the regression modelling on an individual level basis, let alone a country basis, also proves that out.
Yeah.
It also matters about kind of your parental background, how much support you have. Cultural inclusion does matter. So seeing yourself represented in society does matter.
Yeah.
Social contact matters. So basically seeing people and having contact. But I didn't quite anticipate the scale that mindset had completely independently once you've controlled for those factors. And that's really important because you can effectively take someone who's basically pretty privileged, has everything going for them, is literally better off than 99.5% of people who currently exist and 99.9% of people who've ever existed. And they can still basically be kind of definitionally low agency.
Yeah.
So
and that
for me,
is a
that's
cultural
super
story.
important. It is a cultural
Yeah.
story, and it's incredibly important.
Now, were there particular groups that are affected just demographically, in terms of generationally and in terms of gender?
Yeah, I think it was interesting. So we talked about people being optimistic, agentic, and trusting. OAT. It's the easiest way I could do to to basically remember it. I should have included pluralism in there, pluralistic as well, but
Yeah.
POT is less memorable.
Pote.
It was quite interesting. So basically, the millennial cohort, interestingly, are actually quite POTY. Kind of almost half of them. But once you take those guys out, let's say mixture of millennial Gen Z, 25 to 34.
Mm.
Once you exclude those, it's basically an age curve where older people are more POTY,
Mm-hmm.
and then every successive generation is a little bit less, to the extent where you get to the youngest generation, it's only 25%. But it's interesting, it's not a straight age curve. There's kinks.
Mm.
We don't, generational cohorts are different and not in a linear fashion.
Mm.
We found that the split between genders was pretty marginal.
Okay.
So we had like 38% of males who'd be defined as POTY. Females was 34%.
Okay.
Big regional differences.
Yeah.
So London at 50%.
Wow.
But then Midlands, north of England, actually the next highest kind of overall regions. Home ownership, massively correlated. Owning your own house outright. So the idea that the house building crisis has not been a big deal. It is a massive deal.
We talk about it a lot, but I somehow still think it's underrated
Well,
as
it's
a
only-
factor in our...
Well, it is because because the case has not been made. I mean, I wrote a Times column this last couple of weeks where I looked into the polling data, and since 2011, the average percentage of importance of housing as a top 3 issue in the country is about 16%. That is really low. If you consider that it's basically behind people not feeling in control, people feeling less optimistic, agentic, trusting, pluralists, don't have financial control. It leads to the disaggregation of families, geographic fracturing. I mean, that I'm not quite there on the housing theory of everything, precisely because we're talking about like money plus mindset.
Yeah.
But that was really sharply correlated. So people who own their own homes, 44% of people were POTI. If you privately rented, 25%. Other interesting features that came out, there was a bit of a degree difference. So people with degrees were 43%, people without degrees, 32%. But the really interesting one was politics.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where it got, for me, really interesting and really exciting, because you don't normally see Conservative and Labour voters clustered together on any given issue, right? If I was to think about the environment, the size of the state, tax, cultural issues, Conservative and Labour voters don't really sit that near each other on any issue. But interestingly, they were by far and away the two parties that had the highest number of people who were pluralist, optimistic, agentic and trusting. And actually it was Reform voters and Lib Dems and Greens. In other words, the smaller parties, although now not smaller, now co-equal or bigger.
I suppose the anti-establishment or anti-mainstream.
I think that's right, and it provided a slightly simpler explanation behind our kind of new politics, pluralist politics, which is, I guess, the parties of government have failed both in delivery and in content, and so you then have a fragmentation. I hadn't quite realised it's partly driven by deep pessimism, lack of trust, a sense that nothing's getting better. We don't think of Reform and Greens or even the Lib Dems as two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
But this was very much the case. And really interestingly, the polling firm More in Common has recently launched a big kind of public segmentation. And one of the two axes that they'd done was basically that, was around trust and optimism and a sense that things could get better. And really, politics now is pretty much a 2x2 of that. One axis is like optimistic, agentic, more higher trust. And then the other axis is basically where you sit on a whole heap of like cultural issues, whether that's immigration or crime or kind of gender, all of those different things. And basically you can describe all the different segments. Obviously that's left out the economy, which is interesting, more diffuse. So for me, that was really interesting, the idea that you could describe politics through that kind of lens. But I think for me, it's really, really important because it's like the campaign for agency, if you want to call it that, that can start tomorrow. That doesn't need a down payment. The task of fixing the economy is absolutely mammoth and expensive and has loads of trade-offs and is really difficult and will take years to turn around, but it will have to be turned around at some point. But I guess the point about agency, the just do it mentality, or you can just do things. And we should mention Kay Hall, because she's kind of, it was her stuff that slightly also inspired me to look into this. I've always been interested in it, but she kind of like was ignited to actually do a study. But yeah, in terms of the campaign for high agency can start. Don't need any money, definitionally.
Let's get on to what that might look like, what kind of things we can do in a minute. Just before we do, I want to talk about the political classes themselves, because it's fascinating that, it's not necessarily going to be true that politicians should reflect the kind of disposition of the nation generally, right? So if there's a kind of low agency problem in the nation, it could still be that the politicians who rise to the top are high agency, right? But I would say if there's one problem the last successive 100 prime ministers have had, or everyone since sort of Brexit, it's that they haven't known what they wanted to do with power. There's been a kind of low agency problem with our political class, and that they seem to have very small and short horizons, and to not really have that kind of massive sense of confidence and decisiveness and vision that successful politicians, even ones that are terrible successful politicians, like in my view like Trump. I mean, Trump is, I would not want any country run by Trump, least of all the biggest one in the world, but he is undeniably high agency. And I would just say, like, if Keir Starmer or any other kind of political leader in Britain had like 10% of his agency, but with better ideas, that would be onto something. But so I just think it's interesting that you see this problem really kind of embedded in our governing class as well as in the population.
There's two things to that. So first of all, a lot of those politicians, and I'm not here to speak for legacy politics, would say, but what about the institutions? What about civil service? Turns out you can't just do things. Turns out that a Nike approach to government doesn't actually work because you get into the system is really difficult. So, one of the things that I didn't cover, because you can't cover it in a polling exercise, is what makes an institution agentic? How can you actually get stuff through a machine? And you read all the biographies of the prime ministers, and they basically always end up with, well, it turns out it's really, really difficult to change things, and the state dysfunction is really, really large. So
yes, but some of them struggle fiercely against that to get their ideas through, and some of them seem to be quite passive. Some of them kind of accept that's just the way it is.
Well, and some people don't. So it's worth calling out, because he's releasing a book, but to me it's really clear with the more time that elapses, the role that Nick Gibb, who was the schools minister and shadow schools minister for 15 years, was agentic.
Yes.
Basically went round, he said to me, and I had a little kind of chat with him. I was like, how did you do what you do? So let me describe what he did, which is to basically transform how language is taught, phonics, in schools, and what the curriculum is made up of, to the extent that he's transformed English, because education has devolved, has transformed our education system to the extent that some of our English school kids are some of the most well-educated in the world. Basically,
it's one of the few, if not the only, big policy success story of the last.
And it's not just big; it's enormous. The compound effect of that will be enormous. The idea that the Welsh education system is now completely dislocated, like 20 places below on PISA tables.
Wow.
I think I think you have to fact check me, but I think Scotland may have opted out bits of it. Yeah. The difference making capability was enormous. Really interesting. Nick Gibb basically just did it. He basically heard some evidence from I think Scotland actually, and basically looked into the effect of phonics and how if you taught language in a certain way, which I'm now doing with my kids. Yeah. It's totally different to how we learn. They just read, write quicker. Yeah. And he took that research. He said he did site visits to schools every week. I think it was almost the kind of Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours rule. It was actually extraordinary, the number of teachers that he spoke to, and the number of educational specialists.
Yeah, and then he kept going. I mean, the other thing, because the other, without getting too deep into that story, the thing that strikes me about it is, A, that he decided this was a problem and it needed fixing when other people weren't even aware it was a problem, right?
And it was hugely supported as well. I think Michael Gove was a big part of that.
I totally agree.
New Schools Network.
Totally agree. And there was a whole kind of team around them of very talented, driven people. But the second thing is, it's not just do it in the terms of like you do one thing and then it's great, No,
just do it was a final outcome.
Yeah. It's sheer bloody-minded persistence as well over time. That's a big part of the.
And I guess to go to your first point, do politicians, leaders, business people really know? It's hard to be agentic if you don't know where you're aiming for.
Yeah.
If you think about activity, agency is really a mindset about activity and how you direct your activity and how you curate your time.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you don't have any existing objectives or values, objectives are downstream of values and worldviews, then it's impossible to be agentic, because what are you trying to achieve?
It's striking how few politicians are really obsessed by policy problems that they want to fix. I mean, most of them are not. I mean, most of them seem to be content with being there, being a politician, being an MP, being invited to the right things, appearing in the right places. I see, startlingly few of them who are actually, I really want to fix this big problem.
It's really easy just to say it's about politics. The point of the polling is it's everywhere. This is happening in every company, in every institution, in every bit of the public sector. I think it's really easy just to say this is a political problem.
Yeah.
To me, this is a cultural massive cultural problem with the UK, and it does turn out. I mentioned the public affairs firm Edelman have looked into the amount of multi-dimensional grievance that Brits feel, and it's the fourth highest in the world of the 28 countries that they measured, and we're only 2 points off the worst country in the world. And that's not a politician thing. That's everyone everywhere not being accountable.
Yes, but it does respond to, if it's a cultural story, in a way that kind of, there's an optimistic point there, which is, you can change cultural stories, and what elites do and how they behave and how they speak matters. And so I'm just, let's get on to, what kinds of things might change this culture.
So what's the fix?
Yeah. Fix it for us, James. Be high agency.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I say it's someone else's problem. That's very low agency kind of finding. I think role models, as you say, matter. I think actually it's about getting back to specifics. So a lot of the cultural, political conversations are about the execution of abstract things that are unprovable and unquantifiable. And the key thing about being high agency is it's in relation to something that can actually be done that is specific. So we've spoken about Nick Gibb, right? Super specific phonics, and how they're taught in schools. And there just does seem to me, maybe it's with politics. So there's a really good blog that Rachel Wolfe, who I think
brilliant,
very very brilliant woman,
and involved with the school reform.
Yeah, just to bring everything kind of to wrap it all together. She sent me a blog about why we don't have better politicians, and then the blog was really interesting because it was basically recourse to two politicians who were high agency, and she gave the two really specific examples. Was like one was a very kind of low level, kind of one of the kind of American politician, like 5 tiers down from governor, who basically was looking into building regulations, and basically someone was complaining that their processing application was taking too long. So the kind of deputy governor or something had looked into it and had found out that there were 6 laws that meant that the paper application was 1 inch too thick or something, and that this had a massive knock-on effect, and that actually it was taking long because of X, Y, Z. And they got back to that person and then kick-started a chain of looking into all of those different laws and the chain reaction.
Wow.
All off basically a Twitter complaint. And you think about that, that's a very high agency behavior, but it's also what demarcates it as high agency is really specific, and a desire for implementation and a desire for process and a desire for knowledge, not some high level cultural, moral objective.
It's not striking a grand pose.
I think so. And there's also a very, very interesting politician out in, I think, Washington State, and I don't want to get her name wrong, and I think she could become a massive thing, which is Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez. She is the congresswoman, I think, for Washington's 3rd congressional district. Why should you care? She got elected in a Trump district. Not heavily Trump. I think it was Trump by about 5 or 6 points. But it literally every other person elected in that congressional district, from lieutenant governor, because you can measure how people elect for different categories by congressional districts. Every single one is Republican. Yeah. She won it by a couple of points, twice. She's a really extraordinary character. She's 37. She's my age. So I was kind of like, I thought it was quite interesting. I can kind of, it's really interesting when you start seeing people who are kind of your cohort. Kind of, you get that kind of moving in very different positions and directions. She's a really extraordinary character. She won one of the few, I think, 20 or so congressional districts that were Democrat but voted Trump. Her campaign is about making sure that kids can eat fruit and vegetables in daycare, because apparently there were laws that basically meant that they couldn't. And her whole campaign video is her like just wandering around daycare centres on this very specific law. And it's like, you think, what is the answer to populism? What is the answer to low agency culture? A lot of people would say that's really prosaic. I'd say it's the opposite. We need to get back to really specific basics and actually fix things. Turns out that things are not big constitutional things. They're the everyday fabric of of stuff that affects people's happiness and lives, whether that's potholes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the if you look at the Mamdani campaign for Mayor of New York, very, very successful campaign. And actually, although he is a kind of, if you like, a posturing kind of like ideological, quite extreme socialist, his campaign was focused on very concrete things, the costs of running a business, how much we pay for food. And whilst his opponent was this kind of general kind of, centrist who's like, we just need to be competent and sort things out.
I think that's right. And I think campaigning on vibes gets you, only a certain way.
Yeah.
People do need things to change.
Yeah.
And not just at a top line level, like X department needs to get better, or our schools need to get better, or the health service needs to work. It's like really, really specific level. And I think that is very much linked to the care and the passion that I would say business, cultural and political leaders, because I do not think this is just a political problem, have for the stuff of life, the minutiae and detail, like God is in the detail here.
Yeah.
And I think that very much comes out from the study of high agency.
Are there any other figures or movements you see in British life? I just mentioned one, which is there's an activist, or kind of group of activists behind the Looking for Growth campaign and Crush Crime.
Well, I mentioned them actually in my piece.
Guys.
It's Lawrence Newport.
Lawrence Newport and co. Yeah. And they are brilliant at taking very specific things. The famous example recently was, cleaning graffiti of the tube trains. Yeah. And just saying, right, this is a problem. This is a very clear, specific problem. People care about it. It can be solved. Why isn't it being solved? And that to me is a kind of, there's a feeling of high agency about this, amidst all the futility and the kind of despair and the anger. Here are these people saying, here's a problem, let's fix it. It's kind of optimistic and it's forward looking.
100%. And in many ways, let's take Lawrence Newport, brilliant person, very interesting guy. What it is really, another way of thinking about what they're doing, the Looking for Growth group. They've now got chapters, they meet around, it's all about getting Britain moving again, working, the idea that we can be better. It is literally a campaign for higher agency. Yeah. It's slightly the inverse of the broken windows theory. Mm-hmm. So broken windows theory is something that I think the ex-New York police commissioner, Bill Bratton, basically popularised, which is that the way to tackle crime isn't just to solve the murders and the killings and the top line level numbers, it's solving broken windows in communities, because actually low level crime leads to high level crime, and it's the detail. And the high agency campaign of Looking for Growth is a little bit like that, which is like, how can we possibly hope to fix the GDP per capita of this country and public services if we can't fix the little stuff? And it slightly reminded me of a video I've seen recently of Toto Wolff, who I think is the chief executive of the Mercedes F1 team.
Okay.
It's really interesting. It's the videos of him walking into Mercedes-Benz on his first day of work. And I thought he was going to talk about, he's a billionaire. He's a massively successful industrial businessman who happens to be really interested in cars. So he's one of those principles, as opposed to a technical engineer. And it was very interesting. I was expecting he was going to talk about what it was like to walk into the brand of Mercedes and run a company like that was so famous, or something about the engineering team, or something about the head of strategy. And his annoyance was that the Daily Mail was from the wrong week in reception, and that there were dirty coffee cups. And this is his anecdote about one of the most successful, I don't know how many championships they won in F1, I think it's like 7 or something in a row. And his sheer anger at that. And it's really interesting. That's obviously like an attention to detail thing. It's also about, it's actually not just about details, it's about values, and your values work your way up from a really, really low level.
Yes. If he was a leader who only cared about the coffee cups and didn't have a big of it, I presume he does, right? But it's symptomatic of his whole approach, I presume, in this case.
I think that's exactly, that's a good thing to kind of clarify. But I think I'm very skeptical when people say I'm a big picture kind of person.
Yes.
Because I'm like, that's a massive red flag for hasn't done anything specific.
Hasn't done the work, hasn't actually thought it through, and isn't doing anything specific.
And so when people are looking for high agency role models and leaders, It's the person offering the specific solution to something really prosaic and specific and practical in their office, in their company, in the bit of the public sector that they work at. And you can spot them everywhere. It's what people look for in interviews. So one of the really interesting bits of feedback on doing the high agency research that we did is the amount of feedback from entrepreneurs and startups in the venture capital industry, where basically the feedback we got was, and this is straight from the people who run it, was that's literally the thing that we look for. Yes, we expect them to be smart, don't really care where they've gone to university or XYZ or what have you. The superpower that they look for people who create multi-billion pound companies that provide the employment and the tax funds that fund all the hospitals and the nurses and the doctors, the one characteristic they're looking for is agency. And I found that extraordinary because, you know, the reason that our GDP per capita is lower than America, once you take out all the big companies, is basically that.
Yeah.
Which is, how do we create a much richer, enriched network of huge British companies that then stay here and scale here? And it turns out that all these guys are searching for is agency. And I'm like, okay, so what are you looking for specifically? And it's just the idea of people who just get things done and find a way, by hook or by crook, to do stuff. And I'm like, where is that taught? Why
well, I was going
to
ask, actually, kind of my next question is where is that taught, or what is it about an educational institution that does or does not instill that kind of value? I mean,
well, what is agency the opposite of? It's the opposite of credentialism. Credentialism is the idea that because you are X, as a kind of slightly essentialist, I guess, as we're talking about the philosophy of agency, that's enough. Agency is the opposite, which is that it doesn't matter who you are, you get it done. And clearly, American culture just embodies that. You know, there's obviously many drawbacks to so many things about America that you wouldn't wish to replicate. You speaking about one of them at the top of the program, but the agentic culture there is so clear. Like the credentialism is clearly is not as present. But I think for me, the high agency, low agency thing is it's low agency beliefs are everywhere, across every class, every income spectrum. It is clearly a mindset thing. The looking for growth guys are very, very interesting. You know, they're creating chapters, they're just doing things. But I wonder if it will catch on. There's clearly an energy and passion for it amongst a kind of slightly younger group of people who are probably a bit tired of this perma-pessimism, a sense that nothing can improve. Like, who wants to live through 30, 40, 50 years of that? People want to feel that they're in control of their own fate, that they can make a difference. I think it's immensely powerful. I find it very interesting that they're looking for growth group as well, how cross-party that was, like all the launches. Very interesting group of Labour people associated with it. Very interesting group of Conservative and Reform people as well. So yeah, the hope is that we can talk more about agency and actually do something about it. I think the word doesn't help,
right? Because
it's a noun. In relation to something else, it is not easily explainable. And that's why you asked for a definition up top. It embodies a number of different things. Very often the progression of an idea or a cause is very much embodied in how explainable and how quickly the cognizance of an idea, basically. But I think, look, your point about politics is definitely there. I think it's all about those micro campaigns and people just taking control. Yeah.
You've just got to start with something and see where it goes and build.
Yeah.
On that note of faint hope, we will wrap it up. If people want to find out more about your work on agency, where can they look?
Two places. I have a much lesser Substack called the Political Whiteboard. The company where I'm Chief Research Officer, Focal Data, we have a lot of our research into agency there, up online there, focaldata.com. But you're going to be hearing more and more from us on this.
Brilliant. That was fascinating. Thank you so much, James.
Thanks, Ian.